discerning what's important and what's vital. And some of the early stories in the Torah that deal with the presence of the Lord make us realize that some things are important. After God had instituted the setting up of the tabernacle, and it's a tremendous occasion if you read Leviticus 8, which is the implementation of Exodus 29, where Aaron and Moses set up the tabernacle, they consecrated the priests, then Aaron made an offering, and God sent fire down, and the people all fell on their faces and worshipped. This is right at the conclusion of chapter 9. And then chapter 10, it starts off with Nadab and Abihu offering strange fire. And fire comes out from the Lord's presence and kills them. And it's a jarring story put together with the story of God dwelling amongst His people, His presence coming down in a way that all the people fell and worshipped Him. And another story is when David had it in his heart to bring the ark to Jerusalem. And I think all of us know God alone put that in David, that Jerusalem was to be the capital. That's one of those things that's not in the Torah. I don't know of any word that confirms Jerusalem until David chooses it. And he desired to bring the ark. The ark had not been with the tabernacle clear since the time of Samuel. At the time of Samuel, it was taken out to battle. The Israelites were defeated. The Philistines took the ark, and you all know it was a bad scene for the Philistines. They thought they'd gotten Israel's God, and now they had got Israel's God under control. And they found out that Israel's God was harder to control than other nations' gods. Bad things happened to Dagon and all the people. So they sent the ark back on a new cart pulled by cows that had just calved. I mean, they set this up so they would know. And if you read it, they said, if these cows just stand here, then we'll know that all these problems weren't from Yahweh. They weren't from Israel's God. But if these cows with new calves that have never had a yoke or a harness on them, if they take the ark back to Israel, that's probably a good sign that these problems were caused by God's presence. A specific God, the God of the Hebrews, the God of Israel. Well, the ark came to Israel, and the men of Beth Shemesh looked in on it, and they got the same tumors as the Philistines. And finally it came to rest at a man's house, and David felt like it was time to bring it back to Jerusalem. And you all know the story. David, who was a great worshiper, I always find this amazing, he didn't know Torah. And the reason I know he didn't is he imitated the Philistines. This is really important, what I'm going to talk about tonight. We're not going to take a lot of time, but it's something to think about. It's dangerous when God's people copy the world when God has a clearly set out, prescribed way. They got a new cart and pulled it with oxen, and they were taking the ark to Jerusalem. And they were worshiping with all their might. They were praising the Lord. And the ark started to tip, and Uzzah was one of the sons of, I think it was it Obed-Edom, or I might get these two mixed up. It was whoever the ark was with at that time. And his family had been blessed. Uzzah reached out to touch the ark, and he was struck dead. I brought those out because sometimes people will tell you that details don't matter to God. And yet sometimes we can obsess over things that may not be as important as we think they are. And that's why I've taken a little time to introduce the subject I'm talking about, which is going to be the calendar. And we're going to be probably mentioning this in Supreme Council tomorrow. A lot of people think, well, it doesn't matter what's in the calendar. It mattered a lot to Israel. It mattered enough that they never, at the time of Yeshua, they never determined the first of the month until there were two witnesses that could bring that word to Jerusalem, and then they would say, yep, there's the moon has been sighted, and the next day would be the celebration of Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month. And I've prefaced this because what I've noticed is that among Christians, many times we focus on theology and ritual over substance. And yet, I'm not saying theology is unimportant. We talked a little bit about this last week. One of the reasons that people talk about theology is they don't have anything else. If you follow Peter, Paul, and Yeshua, you're going to find very few messages on theology. I mean, I defy you. Read the parables. What parable is about theology? The parables are about life. The Good Samaritan. It's about showing that the neighbor is not the one who has his theology straight. The neighbor is the one whose behavior is right. And the story of the two sons. There can be reconciliation with the father before there's reconciliation with the brother. And there's all kinds of pictures. Part of why we have theological battles in Christianity and the Messianic movement is because our following, our pursuit of Yeshua is so in our head. It's not as much lived. I think I shared with you how impacted I was by this Jewish lady that said, there's a lot of commonality between Christianity and Judaism, but the big difference is Judaism is about deeds and Christianity is about creeds. And to me that was like a gallon of cold water in my face, because I don't want to be about creeds. I really don't. And just so you can understand what I'm talking about before we get looking at the calendar for a minute, how many of you know the battle we've had in the church over transubstantiation? When you participate at the table, are you actually eating the flesh and blood of Yeshua? Is it a symbol of Him? Is it somewhere in the middle? And you know what's interesting? That's not nearly as important as doing it. And yet, the 100 Years' War in Europe is probably pretty much over that. That's what that's over. Is seeing that differently. And you're aware of the Anabaptists. That's the Mennonites, the Amish, the Hutterites. And you think, well, why are they against baptism? Because Anabaptist means against baptism. Well, they were against infant baptism. They weren't against baptism. But it's so enraged the theologians of the time and the people that when a lot of times they would find these Anabaptists and tie them up and throw them in the river and say, well, there, have your baptism. And of course, they drowned because they couldn't move. And so people died over this again. And then when you had, say, all these people were baptizing with sprinkling. And then when you had other people start saying, well, it looks to me, in fact, the Greek word baptismo, it doesn't mean sprinkle. It means to immerse. And we can show you in classical Greek literature that it talks about the baptism of a vessel. It doesn't mean it got sprinkled. It means it got buried with water. Another big battle. And I'm just prefacing my comments by this. In Christianity, there are a lot of things that we see differently. And while they're important, we probably have obsessed over the outward to the point we may have missed what was supposed to happen on the inside. And as I talk about dates, I think the same thing can happen. What's interesting at the time of Yeshua and all through the Bible, we really don't find any conflicts about dates, but one of the reasons, there was a functioning Sanhedrin. In the Bible, it clearly tells us when to celebrate God's feasts. And we'll talk a little bit about this later. But how many of you remember that when Jeroboam seceded from the union, the Bible goes to great lengths to say three things he did that, I'll put it mildly, upset God. There were three things that Jeroboam did that were seen as rebellion against the name of God. Can you tell me what those three things are?
He changed the calendar. He appointed his own feast.
Yeah,
set up his own
he
feast.
set up his own feast, right? It was in the 8th month. Okay, tell me, there's two more.
He set up his own
Yeah,
priest.
and here's an important thing. This is one of the reasons why, sometimes we as Christians say it's not important. But how many of you are aware that Jeroboam was not worshiping another god? He was worshiping Yahweh with calves. And that is heinous to God. The golden calf is the same thing. If you go back and read the story of the golden calf, they built that bull, that golden calf, to represent God. And God does not, it is a strong biblical prohibition. There is not to be worship of God that centers on a physical, tangible object. This is so there was the worship of idols, the changing of the feast date, and then somebody probably said it. What's the other one?
The new priesthood.
He instituted his own priests. And this was practical, wasn't it? Because the priests he had, what was their training?
Go to Jerusalem.
It was to go to Jerusalem, and it was purely Torah. So, what are they going to know? The three feasts are in the first month, the third month, and the 7th month. And someone says there's a feast in the 8th month, they're going to go, sire, no, we're not doing that. And I bring this out because some of the things Christianity has done come close to the golden calf. And I think we want to be careful, again, not to judge. But a lot of people would think, well, why do you even worry about the calendar? A couple of reasons. God says that his celebrations, his Moedim, in fact, one of the things that we've been talking about, and it's really, this is a year, the focus of the house of Aaron is going to be the presence of the Lord. That's our job. It's our inheritance. Well, he's invited us 3 times a year to come to him. These aren't places where we're saying, God, we want your presence. We know you're here. We sense you. That which is true. He inhabits the heavens and the earth. But he says 3 times a year, you meet with me. This is my appointment. And I think we all know it's the 14th day, the evening of the 14th day of the first month, and then the 15th through the 21st day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is very clear. The next feast is a little bit, requires some interpretation because it says, the Sabbath occurring during Passover, the day after you count off 7 weeks, and you celebrate Shavuot or Pentecost, which is the Feast of Weeks. 7 sevens. It's the Feast of Weeks. Now, Judaism today says that the day after the Sabbath, the first day of unleavened bread, the 15th day, the 16th day is when you start the 7 weeks. So that Shavuot is always 7 weeks after the 2nd day of unleavened bread. Where those who take the Sadducee view, and the Sadducees were the priests, they said, no, the day after the Sabbath is the first day of the week. So that Shavuot always occurs on Sunday. Which, in my mind, seems to be what was going on at the time of Yeshua. What's interesting is we don't know for sure. First month, 14th day, 15 through 21. Shavuot, 7 weeks after the Sabbath, occurring during Passover. And then in the fall, there are 3 feasts in the 7th month. First day is Yom Teruah. It's a day for blasts. Teruah is the word. And that's a particular shofar call now. But just a day for trumpet blast, you could see it as just as much. Shofars as trumpets. Some people try to make it all one or the other. Both were more. The 10th day is the feast or the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot begins on the evening of the 14th day, the Arab Sukkot. Then it goes 15 through 21, with 22 being Shemini Atzeret, the capstone of the feast. That might be quite a bit of detail, but you read, everyone should know this. I'll bet there's nobody in this room that doesn't know July 4th and December 25th. These are more important. I want to emphasize, God said this is when He'll meet with us. And for a people whose number one mission is the presence of God, we want to be aware of the feasts. Evening of the 14th day of the first month, 15 to 21, is unleavened bread. Shavuot, 7 weeks after the day after the Sabbath. You count that off. The counting of the Omer, you remember this. And then Sukkot, Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, the first day of the 7th month. Yom Kippur, the 10th day of the 7th month. Sukkot, the 15 through 21, with the final day, the 22nd day, being Shemini Atzeret, which kind of is like the capstone of the feast season. What we have been doing in the house of Aaron is we've been observing the new moon. Those who looked Thursday, it was easy to see. Very clear. And so, based on that, Friday would be the first day of the month. And you would go from there. What we've found is that by going by observation, we're celebrating the feasts at a different time than Judah. And in a different time than a lot of our Messianic brethren. And I'll just share some things with you why I think we might want to modify this. Really, like I say, we'll probably talk about this in council, but I want you to think about it. And I would like us not to think that it's not important. I'd also like us to think it's not worth killing anybody over. In temple times, it was like we do. The moon was observed, and it was based on the observation of the moon. When Judaism was scattered, they didn't have a temple, and especially when during the time of Yeshua, and even after, they had a system of smoke signals. They had several mountains in the land, Tabor and several others, that when the new moon was observed, they would light fires, and people in Jerusalem would know that the new moon had been sighted. So there was a way for everyone to be together and follow the calendar. They had a functioning Sanhedrin, and they had priests in the temple making rulings. When that was gone, a fellow named Hillel II created a standardized calendar that is calculated so that you do not have to watch the moon. In fact, Hezekiah told us when he went to Israel and saw the new moon and blew a shofar, I believe it was a lady, she didn't even know what you were doing. And what did she tell you, that we don't do that anymore?
She says, "What is this?" And I said, "This is a shofar." She goes, "I know that's a shofar. Why are you blowing it?" And I said, It's Rosh Chodesh." She says, "They haven't done that since ancient times."
And the reason they haven't is this calculated calendar. And I'll try to explain to you how it's done. And it's very difficult to our thinking. And here's one of the things I'd point out. I think the months are patterned after the moon because the moon has this cycle. The years are patterned after the sun because the sun and the earth have this cycle. I think we can get carried away with attaching too much sacredness to when it begins or ends. It's even, some of the Essenes didn't like what I'm going to talk about next. With the lunar month, you don't get even months in the year. And so the Essenes some of them were postulating, why don't we go to 12 30-day months? Which if they'd done that, what would that have done to moon sightings?
Immaterial.
They'd be immaterial, irrelevant, which is how our calendar functions now, right? We don't worry about the moon. We call them months. They have nothing to do with the moon. But in Judaism, they did. So what happens, because the month is such a screwy length that, and I don't expect you to remember this, because I frequently mess up on this myself. They have a 19-year cycle. In that 19-year, they have to have 7 leap months. If they don't do that, then the feasts occur at the wrong time of year. And if you read the Bible, it says Passover is to occur in the spring. And if you just went by a year of 12 lunar months, Passover would occur in every season. Because, every year you'd lose a couple weeks. And, Passover would be in December. So 7 out of 19 years, an extra month is added. So there's 13 months. And this was obviously happening before Hallel 2. But I don't know just how they were doing it. Now, so what they were doing is trying to honor the biblical mandate that the feasts occur in the proper season. Season is determined by what? Not the moon, but the sun. And that there's kind of a conflict between the sun and the moon. So 7 out of 19. Now, the other things, and this was entirely arbitrary, they decided that Yom Kippur could never occur on Friday or Sunday. And the reason that was felt is that sometimes it's too difficult to have two Sabbaths back to back. And if you see, if you had Yom Kippur and then Sabbath, how would you prepare for the Sabbath? And I can see their reasoning. I think it's contrived. But nevertheless, I just want to point out why their calendar is the way it is. Yom Kippur can never be on Friday or Sunday, so it precludes the possibility of two Sabbaths together. And then Hoshana Rabbah. Remember that the thing we celebrate in the feast, of what they call the water pouring ceremony on the seventh day. Remember when Yeshua stood on the, John 7 says, on the last and greatest day of the feast, Yeshua stood and said, if a man believes in me, out of his belly will flow rivers of living water. And that last and greatest day of the feast, they make sure it never occurs on Sabbath, because it looks to them like work, bringing the water and the 7 trips around. And so this is totally arbitrary, but that's how the calendar is figured. And if they have to, they add a day to Heshvan, which is the 8th month, if you figure from Passover being the first. Or they take a day from the month of Kislev, which is the month after. It's the 9th month of the sacred calendar, starting in March. So all that to say, this is how Jews observe the day. Now, when it was first suggested to me that maybe we should move our celebration of the feast to be with Judah, I thought, well, I didn't like it because I appreciate the fact of us observing the moon. I think it's essential. And one of the things I've noticed, even in Arizona when we watched, and I forgot to look, we saw it was going to happen, and I forgot. The kids all went and saw it. When you see the new moon, it's one of the clearest reminders of God's faithfulness and His covenants. Because He tells us over and over that His covenants with Israel are like His covenants with the day and the night. And that if you can stop the moon, if you can stop the sun, then His covenants with Israel will be over. He says the same thing about Levi. And so I appreciate that. But I've been thinking about the rift between Ephraim and Judah, and the church in Judah, and it got me thinking, if you have a Bible, it might be worth it to turn. Well, there's a couple places I want to go here. But first go to 1 Samuel 20. One of the things that I recognized when I got looking at this is there must have been some calculation in Israel, that it couldn't have been all observation. And the reason I point this out is in 1 Samuel 20, David and Jonathan are having a talk, and probably you might remember this. But as they're talking, David says to Jonathan in 1 Samuel 20, verse 5, behold, tomorrow is the new moon. Now, how does he know that? Go ahead, Joe.
Well, you can know it if the moon is visible because you can't see it. I mean, you can tell when it's dark of the moon.
Yeah.
The dark of the moon, you certainly could.
And so they would have watched the moon very carefully. It was really the only timepiece they had.
And that's possible what's going on here. But you know, it sounds to me like this is the middle of the day. And that he's saying, of course, he might be, in any case, I see an element of calculation here.
It was one of those things I never understood about Niles. He could look up in the sky and tell you what time it was. I mean, he had that lunar sense. He knew what part of the month it was in. He could tell what time of the day it was. I mean, just, he looked at the moon and he knew.
Oh, yeah, I sort of can tell looking at the sun and the moon. In any case, what I really want you to look at is go to 1 Kings 12 or 2 Chronicles 12. They both say the same thing. When the kingdom split, and we already went over this, how many of you know why Jeroboam committed the 3 sins that he committed? And I think this is very important because I see it happening again in Christianity, and the Christians that honor the Word are not making this error. It's interesting. A lot of Christians who don't believe in keeping the Torah, but they firmly believe that God chose Jerusalem and that Israel is still the land of Israel. I think it's one of the scariest things you'll ever hear somebody say, that God has no longer chosen Jerusalem. Because if that promise is not in effect, what promise is still in effect?
No.
And you think about it, what was Jeroboam's problem? What was his one sin? He didn't want the people to go to Jerusalem. Why I bring that all out is one of the reasons why I think we should continue to observe the new moon, but celebrate at least Passover and Sukkot with the Jews, is so that we do not do what Jeroboam did. Read what it says here in 1 Kings 12:19. Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And I realize in a lot of ways that Yeshua is certainly the house of David more than Judah. But I'd like you to listen to what... You'll hear a lot of misinformation out there from Messianics and conservative Christians about the institution of Easter by Constantine. If you ever hear anybody associate Constantine with Easter, let it go in one ear and out the other. Because Constantine had never heard that word, didn't know what that word meant. But what Constantine did know, and really he didn't do it, he brought his bishops together to do this, is that he didn't like setting the date and being dependent on Jewish calendars. He wanted to be independent, which is so much the spirit of Jeroboam. Jeroboam did not want to be beholden to Jerusalem. But you know what God promised Jeroboam? He says, if you'll serve me, I'll give you a house that will endure. But Jeroboam wouldn't listen to God. And he said, if I let the people go to Jerusalem to worship, their hearts will be turned and they'll rebel against me and they'll want to follow a son of David. He never even gave it a chance, did he? He didn't even give it a chance. And when you look at what he did, we need to examine our church practice and make sure we put... See, this is why I'm so uncomfortable with pictures of Jesus. I don't say they're idols, but I've seen people look at them and sing to them. That's getting close to the calf. Certainly not my call. I'd never judge a person that way. But do you understand what I'm saying? There's nothing wrong with a picture of Jesus. He was a man. But if you start to look at the picture, that's one of the things the Bible utterly prohibits, is looking at any earthly object and worshiping it, or worshiping it as a picture of Yahweh. Because Yahweh is vast, He's huge, He's unknowable, and yet He is known. We can't make Him something tangible. And God goes to great lengths. The proscriptions against idolatry are all through the Bible, and all the New Testament writers upheld them. In fact, when they told the Gentiles in Acts 15, don't do these 4 things, all 4 of those things are idolatry. All they were saying is to come in the door of the synagogue or come in the door of the meeting house for Yeshua, idolatry is over. No sexual immorality, the primary way of worshiping idols. Sexual immorality. Things strangled, blood, and meat sacrificed to idols. Those 4 things, all they were saying is, leave idolatry. We don't expect anything else. You leave your idolatry and come. You can serve the Lord. You can be saved. And he says, Torah will be taught every Sabbath. You'll learn the way of following God. But to come in, just leave your idols. This is one of the reasons, I guess, that I have thought about this. I think it's unfair, but Jews, a lot of them see Christians as idolaters because of some of the things we do. And most of us don't come from traditions that do that. When you go to the land of Israel, you're struck by when the Jews have a holy site, they try to keep everything away from it and leave it the way it was. When the Christians have a holy site, they build a cathedral on it. And which isn't all bad, but one of the things you'll notice, see, none of us have this tradition, but you realize at one time in the ancient church, they actually worshipped bones, artifacts, crosses, things they kissed. And if you go to the Orthodox churches, there's a lot of icons, a lot of figures. And I just say that is questionable ground. Let's put it that way. But when you look at the sin of Jeroboam, it was his rejection of Jerusalem. And so one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of coming together, and let me read you what Constantine said. And again, Constantine felt that the bishops and the date they came up with, he felt like that was the accurate way to date it. He was not copying anything pagan. But he was definitely rebelling against Judah. This is what they wrote. And in the first place, it seemed very unworthy for us to keep this most sacred feast following the custom of the Jews, a people who have soiled their hands in a most terrible outrage and have thus polluted their souls and are now deservedly blind. Very pro-Jewish. Since we have cast aside their way of calculating the date of the festival, we can ensure that future generations can celebrate this observance at the more accurate time, which we have kept from the first day of the Passion until the present time. So he believed, to his credit, that they were doing it right. And any suggestion that he was following some pagan feast is utterly nonsense. What he was actually doing, what they ended up with, is much more the Sadducee calculation than the rabbinic. But there was a huge controversy before Constantine, and that some of the early believers felt like you should celebrate the resurrection on the first day of the week. Others said it should always be celebrated on the 14th day of the first month. And Polycarp, who is supposed to have been a disciple of John the Beloved, was very strong in the camp the 14th day of the first month. They call them quartodecimans. If you're ever reading early church history, you go, what the thunder is a quarto? I mean, I didn't know any more about this. But what you need to know is that Polycarp was a leading proponent that it should always be on the 14th day of the month. That's when you celebrate the resurrection. I find interesting because the resurrection was after. The 14th is when he was crucified. But he and a bishop, the number one bishop that was opposed to him, they came together, they met for 3 days, and they said, you know what, we're not going to come to agreement in this. So everyone could see, they celebrated communion together and said, we're brothers, and separated. Which is Jewish. It's Jewish to agree to disagree. It is not Christian, sadly. I can't think of a church council that ever did something like that. It's this way or that way, or hell. It's one of the reasons that, again, I'm giving you my train of thought, that it seems to me that one of the things we could do is respect Judah. And I'll include something else and then I'm done. The story of the prodigal son, and I think we all know this story. There's 2 sons, and the younger one comes to his father, and he says, I want my inheritance now. And he leaves with his inheritance. This is a very unusual thing because no one ever gets their inheritance while their father's alive. As many Middle East commentators have said, that for a son to come and say that to his father is like saying, Dad, I wish you were dead. In any case, he goes off and wastes his inheritance. And when he runs out of money, it says he began to be hungry. And he didn't have any more friends. Very significantly, Yeshua has him take a job feeding pods to pigs. I don't think there's any question that not only is this a picture of those of us who wander away from the Lord and return, it certainly is a picture of individuals going to the unclean and then realizing we have a Father who loves us. But it's a picture of Ephraim. It's a picture of Israel. Because what happened to Israel? We rejected Jerusalem, and so we were scattered among the nations. Where do we find ourselves? Feeding at the pig trough. Then we wake up through the gospel and we return to our biblical roots. He comes home and he says, I'm just a servant. How many Christians do you hear say, I'm so glad I'm in this and I'm a Gentile? That's what they say. That's not what the Father is saying. The Father is telling the Christians coming home to Him that you're part of the family. You're one of my people. Kill the fatted calf, put a robe on him, and put the ring on his finger. You're brought back into the family. Well, how does the older brother feel about this? He's very unhappy. And there's jealousy going on. Interestingly, Yeshua does not finish this parable because you know what? You and I are called to live out the conclusion of that parable today. That's one of the things God's giving us to do. The reconciliation between the younger brother and the father is a wonderful thing. But that's not the end of the story. The older brother needs to be reconciled to the father and to his brother. And remember in the story, Yeshua has the father tell the older brother, all that I have is what?
Yours.
It's yours. So where does the inheritance lie? With the older brother. Now, what I feel has happened with us Messianics, as we've gotten into Torah and seen that it's eternal, it's beautiful, we're not saved by it, but because we love Him, we keep it. It's totally, people are getting confused. I see Messianics losing Yeshua, and if you lose Yeshua, you've lost the whole purpose of Torah. It's the thing that brings us to Him. But here's the interesting thing. We come to the Torah, and the next thing you know, we're telling the Jews how to keep Torah. Who's been faithfully keeping it for 2,000 years? And in my view, when we go to Judah and tell them how to keep Torah, it's like the younger brother telling the older brother, hey, move aside, I'll show you how to farm. You've only been here 20 years doing it right, but I'm in here 10 minutes, I'm going to show you how to do it. That's not received well, and what's more, it doesn't help bridge the gap. What's more, if we will learn how to reach out and reconcile with Judah, maybe we'll start to see how to reconcile with the rest of the church. And one of the first things to realize, we are not going to reconcile by telling people what's right and they have to do it our way. And, or worse yet, they have to think our way. I've seen a few people that it seems to me have really accomplished this reconciliation with Judah. The Bethel community, where several of us have been privileged to go, and you all know the story. They were praying in Germany. They felt the Lord tell them to go to Israel, to repent for the sin of Germany, and to just serve Israel. And of course, they went to Israel. What would that have been? About 1960, anybody know? 1, 62, 63? I don't remember. Do you remember, Kaya, when it was? In any case, there was nothing in the world worse to a Jew than what they were. They were Germans and they were Christians. And they were here to help. I mean, they were hated. They would build up buildings and the kids would come in and knock out the windows and break down the walls. And they just kept building them back up. And one significant case where these 3 youth came in and really ransacked something they just worked on and finished. The local police caught the 3 young guys and brought them to the community so they could charge them, and they said, we're not going to charge them. We're not going to do that. We forgive them. And you think, how nuts are they? But I think you probably all know the story that 20 years later, when they were trying to get a permit to build next to Samaria, a process that takes 3 to 5 years took them a couple of months. They wondered what happened here. The mayor of Samaria was one of these young boys that they had forgiven. And here's the thing I find significant. They don't do anything unless it blesses Israel. If they build a company and it looks like it's competition, they won't do it. They build companies that will hire Jews, bless the nation. They've even agreed to work in the military however they can. And my point is that their servant attitude, they now experience favored status in the land like nobody else because Israel can trust them. Mind you, this is important for us reaching out to Judah. I don't think it's worth quibbling over the dates. I think we still need to observe the new moon. I think that's a powerful picture of God's faithfulness. I still believe Yom Teruah should be celebrated when we see the new moon. But I believe we at least ought to look at Passover and Sukkot, celebrating it with them and recognizing we are so grateful that they've been keeping the feasts all these years while we neglected them. What's more, and we talked a little bit about this the last couple times, I've been really casting about how do we start to bring things together. I'm so struck by how fractured Christians are. And it appears to me the way that we bring people together is you serve them. This means that you find out ways you can serve. One of the number one ways, I believe, when you go to the Bethel group, this is one of the reasons that they have been such a powerful tool for unity, because when someone comes to them, they're more interested in healing and blessing them than fixing them. I think it's a crucial pattern for us, and I certainly don't have all the answers. You know, we've got people we're working with specifically, but I see a need in this next year to focus on the presence of the Lord and to recognize that one of the things holding back God's presence is unity. Unity that's a loving, powerful unity. And it seems to me, and I certainly welcome comments and thoughts from the rest of you, that one of the things we can do is to serve those that are different from us, however we can. And one of the ways we can do that, like I said, you can pray for people. I'm struck by the number of people that have gotten into the Messianic movement, and as they came to see some of these truths intellectually, they've come to think, like a lot of evangelical Christians, that you're saved by what's up in your head. It just, in fact, if you tell, a lot of them are really concerned about the coming of the Antichrist, and they're worried about the miracles and the power of the Holy Spirit going out because they're sure it's counterfeit. And here's the thing that I find interesting, is that they're so concerned about it that they won't even go see. They'd rather be sick and keep their pure theology. And somehow, one of the ways that Levi and Aaron can reach out, like the writing says, is to bear goodwill to all. And some of the goodwill is healing. It's restoration. It's deliverance. It's all the restoration, renewal. All those things. And none of those things are theological. They're based on sound theology, but they're based on knowing the Lord, not knowing all this stuff about Him. Ron, I think, did you have your...
Well, I was just going to say, about a month ago, some prominent Christian made the statement that anyone who speaks in tongues and all Pentecostals are of the devil and going to hell.
Yeah.
I mean, you just brought that out. I mean, that's a pretty... I guess he's a fairly prominent individual. I don't know who it was.
I know who it is.
Oh, you do. You know who it was.
Was he an Anabaptist?
And when I was told that, I said, well, that sounds like he is a...
Yeah.
I said, sounds like he is a... And they said, that's right.
But and the thing is that what I find when we hear that, my first thought is I just want to destroy him logically and just ruin his arguments. But you know what? He's not. He's just like everybody else we're trying to reconcile with. We need to be humble and submitted, and you experience the power of the Lord. I'm struck by, when you read the book of Acts too, it's another thing. And people will sometimes think I'm anti-theology because I get all this theology from people, and I try, it's like, we got a one on Messianics today that said, Paul is a liar and a false prophet. That's his post. And of course, there's 100 replies. And it's somebody just trying to stir up trouble. But also, there's this thing that I believe, and I've said this for some time, but I'm just setting you for the focus for the house of Aaron for this coming year, that people need the real thing and not talking about the real thing. And so, I mean, this is as much on me, you know, Mary sends out to the interceding council every day, prayer focus, foci is the proper word, but we'll say focuses. And 3 days we prayed for Alan, and then I think today we started with Arlene. And I faithfully do that, and I appreciate it. But one of the things that's been heavy on my heart, and I know it's got to be heavy on Mary's heart, is I'm praying for so many people that are really, really sick. And I know God has called me to be faithful in it, like we said today, that His faithfulness does not depend on my experience. But I'm also so firmly of the belief that those who will stay this course until we see God break out and start to heal and bless, it gets rid of some of this nonsense. You know, Ken Hill explained it so well years ago when he went to work for Word Perfect. And they came in and they had a class on how to handle callers and how to take care of computers. Everybody was bored. They were doodling and, you know, I know what's going on. Then they put everybody to work for a half day. Then they got them back together and everybody was on target. How do you answer this question? You know, suddenly it mattered. Suddenly the reality was there. And I think when God's people walk in that power, people want to know your theology. They want to know who you know. It doesn't become this battle. Doesn't it seem to you sometimes like it's a food fight? It's just a paintball fight. It just, nothing comes out of it. And I like what the writings have to say about this. It's one of the reasons I continue to have a testimony. It says, the man of God is not known by what he spreads abroad. He's not known by what comes out of his mouth. He's known by what he does. What's the power in his life? How he changes. I realize we all have different callings and gifts. I sense I know some of mine. I don't know if I know all of mine, but I know we're all called to pray for people. And I also know, when I look at both the writings and the Bible, that there's a level of experience with the Lord that God yearns to see His people walk in, that we're not waiting for Him. That's another way I delude myself. Well, when He's ready, when it's time. And you know, it's like Daniel. He checked the book of Jeremiah, the 70 years were up. Well, let me tell you something. The 70 years are up. This is the time. And so, I put this forward as one of the things to reach out, to serve and acknowledge Judah, a way to be at one with people. I certainly welcome your opinions, but I would rather be kind and loving than right. Right now, after some of my Facebook things, I'm not so... And you know, in a heartbeat, when you see something like this come up, you can tell the people that are grounded and know who the Lord is and what's important, and you can tell the people that it's all in their head. And they're going to win a point. Believe me, I know how to be that way. Let's have an argument. And we'll generate a lot of heat. There will be no light. There will be a lot of heat. But I'm excited about the time we live in. But I also believe, you know, I don't know about the rest of you, but we're praying for a lot of people that are really hanging on the edge. And I'm just asking you, keep praying, keep seeking God, keep moving, because those promises were made to you. They were made to me. And, you know, again, I was going to say, go through the book of Acts and find the amount of theology that's in there. And there's theology, that's good stuff, no question. But notice that when Paul is trying to share his faith with Sergius Paulus, and Elymas is resisting him, that Paul just looks over there and says, you're going to be blind until sunset. Keeps going on. He's blind until sunset. And it says, Sergio Paulus believed because he was amazed at the teaching. And I don't want to blind anybody. And of course, Paul didn't either. But that man, you know, I don't know about you. I have a hunch that not only did Sergius Paulus believe, it's a good chance Elymas did. If I were Elymas, I hope I would. And we all have a different place to play in this. But as I close here, let's be servants to those we oppose, or that those that are different. Let's not say we oppose. But you know, we go back to the restoration, and they're going to be coming here in March. Let's be their servants. How can we help? How can we bless? For the Mormons, Messianics, all those people that touch our lives. And you know, I can tell you right now, one of the things that you have done that have blessed people more than anything is praying for their people. The people in Baker are convinced that when Aspinall prays for people, that they're healed and saved. And that's just the Lord that's convinced them of that. And one of the most powerful things for Fred is the way people here pray for him and for Mary Lou. Makes, you know, that transcends this other stuff. Kai, did you have a comment?
Well, what I feel very strongly, you know, as far as the calendar and all this stuff, and I like hearing that the presence is going to be the focus. The word that I hear so strongly for what's going on, though, is the power of God is the gospel. And that the reconciliation is in what happened on the cross. And so, whatever we do, you know, I'm not saying there aren't compromises or there aren't reasonings or things that you can do, but ultimately what brings God's people together is what Jesus did on the cross. And having that power at work in our life is what's important, and that will manifest in different ways of service and being obedient to God's word, no doubt, humbling yourself before others. But
Well, don't you think that really is what the power of the cross is humbling yourself?
yeah, just to really put our faith in that is, you know, I guess I don't know how to express what I'm feeling. Just, it's easy to rely on reasoning things and needing to justify things, or thinking that, well, if we start doing this, then we can start working together, when it's the cross. It's just the cross.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and I totally agree. If you read, Paul says it. He says, how does he put that? The message of the cross is the power.
Foolishness and the stumbling block, but it's power to those who believe.
Yeah. And he also says that God sent me to preach the cross to you, not with words, lest I empty the cross of its power. And you'll find one of the passages that's been very strong on me today is 301, where Bishop had his experience and he saw the people milling and confused, which I think has been true for a long time, but I think it's really true. And it's interesting, the first thing he says is, build a house for all my people. And then he says, show not the faults of your brethren. And I look at that and I think, we actually know what we're to do. It's how to accomplish it. And this is very strong upon me. To build a house for his brethren, you first have to be hosting the presence, because it's not his house unless he's there. And studying is important. I think knowing facts, I think we as priests and the family of Aaron, we should know the Torah, we should know the Bible. All those things are important. But then, of course, I agree with you, Kaya, that it's all about how does this implement or bring to bear the power of the cross on individual situations. And I know one of the things that's hard for me is that sometimes, in fact, often the cross at first glance looks like failure. How many of you would think, if you were in Jerusalem the day that Yeshua was put on the cross, that it looked to you like a triumph? In fact, I was thinking about that today and talking about faithfulness. I think it's Matthew says, and all the disciples fled. They're out of there. Go. And but then Peter and John came back. So anyway, think about that in terms of the calendar, and also practically how we move forward in the coming year. And again, my belief, if there's a perpetual covenant, not if, there is a perpetual covenant for Aaron to carry the ark on his shoulders, then it would indicate to me that the house of Aaron should always be carrying the presence of God. And that Israel has the right to expect, when they come to us, that they can find and encounter that presence. And I realize he's not limited.
That's where that scripture in Kings, you know. I think part of our prayer should be, you know, Lord, we don't want to be in rebellion against the house of David, because then we are in rebellion against God, because that's where his throne is. I mean, and that's where, when I read that scripture, there was something in that just really hit me, and it's like, okay, Lord, reveal to us where we're in rebellion
That's
towards the house of David. I mean, because to me, that's what we need to be able to see so that we can repent and turn and say, Father, I am all yours. I want to be fully in your house, not divided, because the unity is imperative.
And I agree, and I think that's one of the things that have come out to me with a lot of Christians. You find right now they completely support the Jews in the land, and they support Jerusalem as the city of God. And yet we have other bizarre teachings coming out, a teaching from the Church of Scotland and another church in England that they're saying God's covenants with Israel are over, and the land has, and it isn't that I hate those people, but that teaching I find very much in rebellion against the house of David, and it's a teaching that leads you down that path. And this is something that's really been strong on me. Jeroboam did not set out to be an idolater, to change the priesthood, or to change the feast. He set out to avoid Jerusalem. And so one of the things in my heart is to choose Jerusalem, to not rebel against the house of David, however God would show us that. And certainly, when you think of the house of David, number one, Yeshua is king. Well, I appreciate your comments. Let's all stand.